Happy Saturday, Risers. Saagar and I are back to take another look at some of our favorite segments from this week. We spoke with The Intercept's Ryan Grimm about how Bernie Sanders could win the 2020 primary. We talked to Zed Jelani. He dropped by to discuss foreign policy positions of the Democratic candidates. And Saagar and I announced we wrote a book. It's called The Populist Guide to 2020.
That's right. But the dominant topic of the week was, of course, the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran. We had a number of guests on this week to discuss the increasingly fraught situation in the Middle East, including Aaron Maté, host of the Pushback on YouTube. He explained how Bernie Sanders might be one of the few credible anti-war voices running in 2020. Let's take a listen.
Bernie Sanders, back in 2017, there was a measure in the spring of 2017, spring and summer, that amidst the Russiagate madness was calling for new sanctions on Russia, but also to accommodate Republicans was also calling for new sanctions on Iran. And Bernie Sanders stood apart from everybody else on the Democratic side in both the House and in the Senate to say that he was voting against these sanctions, which was a very brave move at the time because it was very in style to support any kind of punishment of Russia. But Bernie Sanders said he was voting against those sanctions because he wanted to save the Iran nuclear deal. Well, imagine if Democrats had followed his lead and instead of voting for new sanctions on Iran, had tried to stop the sanctions that Trump was reimposing and had stood up to Trump's march to war. So Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard both can take credit for trying to stop what has happened.
So,
interesting point there.
Such a good point. And I still see idiots on Twitter saying, oh, he's in Russia's pocket because he voted against Russian sanctions. Like, no, you idiots. He was voting against Iranian sanctions that every Democrat should have voted against because it was an integral part of what got us to this disastrous situation we're in right now. But people are stupid, what can I say?
People are dumb.
Also, our good friend Trita Parsi stopped by the show this week to debate the Hudson Institute's Mike Prejean about whether or not the American airstrike against the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani made Americans safer. During their back and forth, he laid out what could happen next between the Islamic Republic and the United States.
If we take a look at what happened in the last couple of days, the Iranians said that they would retaliate. They did. They said that they would strike directly and not via proxies, and they did that. They said that they would target military assets, and they did that. I think that was very deliberate in the sense of trying to signal the United States they mean what they say. And now they're saying that this was a proportionate response, and I think they're playing that up for their own domestic political purposes because they're claiming that there were a lot of casualties, and apparently there were not. But I think what they're saying now is if the United States responds further and escalates further, then they're going to target U.S. bases in Dubai or throughout the region. They even included Israel in it. Yeah. Right. So I think the signal there is, okay, both sides have done something. This is now, they put a lid on it. If the U.S. takes a further step, the Iranians will escalate further as well. But there's an exit for both sides now. That does not mean, however, that the tensions will necessarily diffuse. It will just go into a different phase. And I think the Iranians are going to be focused on their longer strategic objective, which includes everything from, the U.S.'s position in Iraq and things of that nature.
It's interesting. We always appreciate Trita's perspective. He always brings us really just an insight into the Iranian regime and the society there, and telling us and warning about how that they could be perceived. I mean, it generally seems since that interview that what we wanted to happen did happen. Is that both sides took the off-ramp. The president, authorizing some economic sanctions that will be newly announced. But let's be honest, there's nothing left to sanction in the Iranian economy. The entire thing is sanctioned to all hell. And so as long as there's no military escalation on behalf of the United States, military response, we are in a de-escalatory pattern for right now. But it's shaky ground, and it really could explode at any moment.
All I will say is, to the best of my recollection, we've had Trita on this show a number of times, and he's been right about
he pretty much
everything. So when I want to know how the Iranians may be processing things, where this process is likely to go next, I always look to him because he has been so insightful on this whole thing.
He really is. All right, finally, we wanted to return to our conversation. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, she explained how she attempted to prevent the current situation with Iran back in 2018, but was stopped by members of her own party.
In 2 years ago, 2018, in that year's National Defense Authorization Act, the big defense bill that's passed every year, there was a provision that was snuck in kind of in the final hour, 3 pages long, saying we authorized the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to develop and implement a counter-Iran strategy without coming back to Congress for any kind of approval or authorization. And the key words there, develop and implement, basically was a blank check to the administration saying, go at it. You develop and you execute a counter-Iran strategy. This is a big problem for me, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I introduced an amendment on the House floor that simply stripped that provision out of the bill, basically saying, if you want to go to war with Iran, come to Congress and make your case. You don't get to sneak this in the dark of night. Made that case on the House floor, brought it to a vote. 60 members of Congress supported my position of upholding the Constitution and Congress's authority to determine whether or not to declare war against Iran. And there was a majority of bipartisan support for this blank check. So I think it's important that we look to members of Congress now who are up in arms. When they had a chance to take action, they failed.
Well said. I'd forgotten some of that history, but the bottom line point is this moment was entirely predictable. Members of Congress had multiple chances to act before it came to this, to reclaim the power that they should have and be able to exercise as an equal branch of government. And they didn't want to. It's not that they failed, it's that they didn't want to. And she's been one of the very few consistent voices across administrations for reclaiming that power, for restraining the powers of war so that we don't end up mired in yet another endless war overseas.
Always what shocks me about this is that the American public, I say this all the time, has voted 3 subsequent presidential elections to get the hell out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And think about their representation in Congress. Why is it there are only fringe elements within Congress that dare to vote for the War Powers Act or to constrain presidential powers on this when it actually matters? And that's why. It's because of moneyed interests, and it's because none of them, they're all cowards, and they don't actually want to take a vote on anything real.
And if you want to know why the Democratic establishment hates Tulsi Gabbard so much, it's because she's willing to call them out for their cowardice. That does it for us. We'll be back later today for our recurring segment with Katie Halber from Rolling Stone's Useful Idiots podcast, where we break down the week that was in media mishaps.
Tomorrow, we're going to have another round of Rising Qs. We'll see you guys then.